Washington Likes, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice, and also work on the Migration and Human Rights Project with many of you in the room. So this evening we have the great pleasure to welcome Cecilia Menjívar to Boston College, a return visit actually to this very building I learned earlier, and to present to you a book that she and Daniel Kanstroom here at the law school edited, which was published last year. We're delighted that she's able to be with us this evening, and also that Westy Egmont is going to comment on the book. So, as many of you know, Cecilia Menjívar is professor at the School of Social and Family Dynamics at the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Arizona State University. Her research focuses on the effects of macro-structural processes on individuals' lives and actions. So we're glad we have numbers of social workers here who are quite committed to this line of investigation. She examines social worlds of individuals who live in hostile and violent environments. Her research interests have two main focuses, as some of you know. The first is the US-bound migration experience. She's been studying the effects of legal, social, and economic exclusion on different spheres of social life among immigrants, including social networks, family, gender relations, religious participation, and transnational ties, focusing particularly on Central American immigrants in the United States. Her second site of research intersects with life in Latin America with a particular attention to Central America, and she's interested in issues of structural adjustment on daily life as seen through the lens of gender. She's interested in issues of state terror, highlighting the political aspect of world systemic relations. She's done extensive field work in Guatemala, where she's written about violence in institutional forms, political, gender, and symbolic. She has published extensively, and her publications have been recognized by her profession and by the wider social scientific community. And we're delighted that she teamed up with Dan Kanstroom to edit this extraordinary volume on constructing immigrant illegality. As many of you know, Dan Kanstroom is a professor of law and the Thomas Carney Distinguished Scholar, as well as an associate director at the Center for Human Rights and International Justice. Professor Kanstroom was the founder of the Boston College Immigration and Asylum Clinic, in which students represent indigent non-citizens and asylum seekers. He and his students have won many high-profile immigration and asylum cases and have provided counsel for hundreds of clients over more than a decade. Actually, that should read 2 decades. He and his students have also written amicus briefs for the U.S. Supreme Court, organized innumerable public presentations in schools, churches, and community centers. He's also the co-founder of the Immigration Spring Break Trips, and as actively engaged in the Post-Deportation Human Rights Project, which he also co-founded. In addition to all of this activism, he is widely published, having written several books on this topic, edited several others, and his articles and short pieces have appeared in venues including the Harvard Law Review, the Yale Journal of International Law, Georgetown Immigration Law Journal, and many others. We're delighted that he has agreed in the midst of finals and all the rest to be with us tonight to talk about this wonderful book. And then finally, Westy Egmont, who is the professor of practice at the School of Social Work here at Boston College. He heads something called the Immigration Integration Lab at the Graduate School of Social Work, and also teaches courses on integration, comparative social policy, immigrant and refugee policy issues. Although a native of New York, Westy has been here for many years and is widely recognized as a social activist in the immigrant community here in Boston. He incorporated Covenant Housing, developed the Greater Boston Food Bank, served for a decade as executive director of the International Institute of Boston, the largest immigrant and refugee service agency in New England. He speaks often and broadly at colleges and universities and in a variety of conference contexts. Westy co-chairs the Massachusetts Governor's Advisory Council on Immigrants and Refugees and has been appointed by 5 governors as an advisor.
6 as of today.
Bravo. He served as the co-chair in the 2010 National Immigrant Integration Conference. So the format for this evening is Dr. Menjívar will begin with some comments. Professor Kanstroom will add to those comments, extending them in different directions, and then Dr. Westy Egmont will comment on the book, and there'll be ample time for questions, discussion, and for you to share some of your perspectives. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank you so much for the event and for coming to listen to our discussion. This is very special because this is the first time we present our book. So this is, I think it's a very important book. So my comments are going to be very brief because I want to leave enough time for questions from you and discussion. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about how this book came about. In my work, I've been very interested and very focused on how the legal context of reception for migrants, mostly from Central America, impacts their daily lives, impacts their lives as individuals, their lives in families, and their communities. So, and because I've been studying Central Americans who happen to hold a variety of legal statuses, I've been always thinking about legal status as a very important marker of social stratification. So, but in recent years, that has been it's an idea that has been explored by other scholars and has been it's been gaining more attention. And so with Manuel Vasquez from the University of Florida, who also has been doing work on the lives of people who have been categorized by the legal context of reception as undocumented, we were thinking of bringing together a group of colleagues, a group of scholars from a wide variety of disciplines to think and reflect on this concept of illegality. What is illegality? Why is it so important? We know that individual immigrants who are placed in this category experience life in a very different way. We know that they earn lower incomes than people who are categorized in legal statuses that are more stable. We know that they go through life and go through the process of immigrant integration in very different ways and in very disadvantaged ways. So we wanted to bring a group of scholars from different disciplines to help us understand what this category is, how it is lived, and how we can maybe propose enough scholarship so that there can be some change. So we invited, of course, Dan, because we knew that we couldn't do this alone. Social scientists or humanities people couldn't do this alone. So we invited Dan, and we also invited Dan Kerwin and Bill Ong-Hin to help us understand what is this illegality? What is this? How is it? How it impacts people and how people respond to the condition of living in illegality. And we held a workshop in San Francisco in March of 2011, and we had a very good discussion. And then Dan and I agreed to put all the work together and into a volume. And so we ended up editing this volume. And one of I think, the highlights of the volume is that from the different disciplines, from sociology, from political science, from history, from law, everybody examines the category, how it has been formed historically, how it's been transformed, how it's debated, how it impacts people's lives in different ways, because not everybody who is in this category experiences illegality in the same way. We know that there are gender differences in how people experience illegality. We know that there are geographical differences. People in different neighborhoods who are in a situation of illegality experience the category in different ways. We know that older and younger people experience illegalities in different ways. So we have a very But I think it's a very interesting discussion of how illegality also forms part of an intersectional lens to examine the lives of immigrants. And so this is what the book is about. And, but we also know that people are not simply reacting to living in, people are not mechanically just living in illegality, people also are responding to that condition. And so we wanted to include a section on responses. And that was an important section of the book because it's responses from people who live in illegality, but also responses on the part of people who who identify with the plight of people who live in illegality, but who have formed coalitions to respond to illegality. And then we end the book with a couple of chapters on policy discussions and some I think propositions on how to move people away from this category. So I don't want to take more time because I think I just gave you a very brief summary of how we arrived at the book and what's in the book. But I want to make sure that we have enough time to answer your questions. And so,
Thanks. I'm going to take a little more time just because I like to talk. It's wonderful to be here. My main memory of that conference, which was in San Francisco, and I'm forgetting the name of the place, but it was really a lovely place near the Presidio. My main memory is that the whole time there was a smell of bacon in the air because they were having another event, and we kept debating, what is the metaphor here? What is the meaning of that? We couldn't quite figure it out. But anyway, thank you all for coming here to talk about this book, and more importantly, this very strange concept of immigrant illegality. I think that maybe the first thing that I'd like to highlight is how recent an idea the illegal immigrant really is, or at least how recent the term is as it tends to be currently used. We're sort of used to it now, but it's a pretty recent idea. Of course, we've had recurrent bouts of anti-immigrant hysteria in this nation of immigrants, for sure. And there have been similar terms. I mean, Thomas Jefferson actually wrote about the friendless alien. You know, there has been this idea of the alien for sure, but this modern epithet of illegality is a surprisingly recent construction, dating really only back to the early-ish mid-20th century. It's also worth recalling, as May Nye does so well in a wonderful book that she wrote called Impossible Subjects, that human illegality, by which, let's face it, we have historically mostly meant Mexicans, and to a lesser extent Central Americans, it's an especially problematic and complicated idea, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about. Cecilia, of course, has done extremely important work in this area, not only in this book, but in many of her other writings, and I would commend that body of work to you, particularly the students in the room who want to get deeper into this subject. The usage of the term has become a subject of great popular debate, particularly at the New York Times. As you may know, there was a debate about whether to even use the word. There's a political debate about other terms that might be used. Is it improper to use it? Is it equivalent to a sort of racist term? With my students, we've explored other possible phrasings and settled on the phrase the documentarily challenged, which has some virtues and some other deficiencies. So I thought it would be interesting to go back through the archives of the New York Times and see what was the first usage of the term illegal alien. And I thought I knew a lot about this subject, but I actually didn't. I found something quite interesting. The first usage by the Times, strangely enough, this will probably surprise you, was about a person named Andrew Donaldson of Ireland, who was arrested in 1926 after allegedly illegally riding his bicycle from Toronto, Canada, through Buffalo all the way to Framingham. I kid you not. The title was Over Border on Bicycle. Arrests reveal novel method of illegal alien entry into the country. This is the first reported usage of the term illegal alien in the New York Times. And it describes how Police Sergeant Walter Gilligan arrested Andrew Donaldson on a charge of illegal entry. Apparently Donaldson admitted right away that he had ridden approximately 300 miles on his bicycle. to Framingham, where he had a cousin. He then wrote to an acquaintance, one Hiram Walsh of Toronto, and explained to him that he too could get into the country that way by just riding his bicycle across the Canadian border. And he was successful too, for he was with Donaldson when the latter was arrested. The two men were locked up. That's the beginning of the story. Perhaps a little more relevant for our purposes is a story that I later found by Gladwin Hill, who some of you may have heard of, written in 1951. Now this, I think, is also quite interesting because it does show in some ways how things change, but they don't change. The title here, 1951, so now we're talking 49, 64 years ago, quite a way, but still within living memory of some people here, not me, but perhaps others. The title is "Million a Year Flee Mexico Only to Find Peonage Here." And I just want to read you the beginning of this because, again, I found this quite fascinating in terms of how little, in some ways, has changed. 1951, San Antonio, Texas, March 24th. A visitor to the Southwest today has to make a double mental adjustment to comprehend the conditions he finds. First, he has to think back to Prohibition days, when wholesale violations of the laws of the United States were being tacitly ignored, tacitly sanctioned, or overtly encouraged by a large cross-section of the population. Second, he has to project himself in imagination back a full century to the days of slavery, when the systematic exploitation of an underprivileged class of humanity as cheap labor was an accepted part of the American social and economic order. Then the observer has to compound mentally these two diverse anomalies and conceive of their existence in 1951. I would add, we might as well just say 2015. For that, in effect, is the situation today in the Southwest and in parts of the Deep South and the Far West as well, arising from the ceaseless and steadily increasing tide of illegal immigration from Mexico into the United States. This illegal immigration now amounts to more than 1 million individuals a year. They sneak across the thinly patrolled 1,600-mile border between Brownsville, Texas and San Diego, California, in an unending hejira from Mexican unemployment and wage levels as low as 40 cents a day, and so on. Now, I just want to conclude by pointing out how some of the language has changed quite a bit here. He says, some 500,000 of these, quote, wetbacks, unquote, so-called because of those who swim the Rio Grande, were caught by the United States Immigration Naturalization Service. And he concludes by saying, a large number of, quote, wetbacks, unquote, regularly slip back into Mexico after seasonal farm work ends, but tens of thousands of others have remained in the United States, managing to settle down in semi-hiding in hundreds of communities along the border, or becoming transient laborers and filtering northward over the western half of the country all the way to the Canadian border. Technically, every one of these, quote, wetbacks, unquote, is an illegal alien. So this I think is quite fascinating. The most important point that I think I would raise from, there's a lot packed into that, and there's a lot packed into that we should talk about, I think, about race and about exploitation and about language and about the continuities of history and so forth. But one thing I would highlight is that this idea of the illegal alien was not created by some sudden disrespect for the rule of law among Mexican migrants. That's not what happened. It was caused by a sudden, profound change in the meaning of the southern border. Whereas Mexican laborers were long recruited, transported, and then employed and exploited in the United States for centuries, this is what changed in the 20th century. Suddenly, what had once been a labor question or a transportation issue became a legal issue. Although even then, if you read the history of this, there were intriguing exceptions built in, such as what was known as the famous Texas Proviso. I don't know if anybody's heard of this. There was as this flow of labor was being rendered illegal through changes in U.S. policies. And by the way, this is pretty sudden. I was just writing something else about the history of citizenship, and I just want to tell you a side story here. There's a famous case at the U.S. Supreme Court called Perez versus Brownell, and that case dealt with the question of citizenship, of who was a U.S. citizen and how you might prove it and various things about that. The interesting thing is this guy Perez, it turns out, had entered the United States 3 times in the 1940s. He was born actually in Texas, but then he was brought to Mexico as a child, so he was a US citizen. And yet he entered the United States 3 times during the Second World War by falsely claiming to be a Mexican. So why would a person have done that? Because the legal regime at that time was so powerfully in favor of recruiting Mexicans to work on the railroads and in the farms that he was actually better off claiming to be a Mexican than trying to prove that he was a US citizen, which he was basically unable to do because he didn't have the proper documentation. After the war, it suddenly became impossible to re-enter as a Mexican. He was caught in Texas, and then for the first time he raised his citizenship claim. And when you hear the arguments at the Supreme Court, the Solicitor General mocks him. He says, oh, 3 times he came, he was a Mexican, and now suddenly he claims to be a US citizen. The point is, he was both. He was always both. But in one historical period, when the recruitment mechanism was so strong, he was fine claiming to be a Mexican. In fact, that was a better strategy. After the war, that changed. And that's the period that I'm talking about. Anyway, this Texas proviso actually there was a bill that had made it illegal to harbor or conceal an illegal entrant, made it a felony in 1952. The Texas delegation, because Texas was dependent on migrant labor, got an exception into that law that said, yes, it's a felony to illegally harbor or conceal an illegal entrant, but not for if you're employing an undocumented migrant in Texas. That would not constitute harboring or concealing them. So there were always been exceptions. The rule of law has never been an absolute principle. It's always been a complicated enterprise. But the big story is that after the end of the so-called Bracero program in 1964, which we can talk about, US immigration laws changed dramatically. And what had been a relatively open and fluid system became subject to massive backlogs, unprecedented difficulties for Mexican migrants, either to enter the US and, as importantly, to leave the US and then come back. There had always been this seasonal flow of labor, but suddenly the border was erected and the law was erected as an absolute impediment to that. And that, in essence, is what created the idea of the illegal alien. But the recruitment continued, as did the massive poverty and corruption in Mexico, and similar, if not worse, poverty and violence in Central America, much of it supported by Cold War US policies. And I think that you cannot have a discussion about this concept of illegality without understanding the economics and the history and the politics of these periods. Anything else, I think, is just simple-minded. So where does that leave us? I'm hoping in Q&A maybe we can talk about DACA and DAPA and Dreamers and presidential executive actions and the rule of law itself, which I've written a lot about. But I want to close with just a short quote from the part of the introduction to the book that I wrote, and then a quote from a recent Times op-ed that just came out a couple of days ago. So in the book, which you can buy, I wrote, from the beginning of its modern invocation in the early 20th century, the often ill-defined epithet of human illegality has figured prominently in the media, vigorous public debates at the national, state, and local levels, and in presidential campaigns. Indeed, for more than a century, more than a quarter century now, the term illegal alien has served as euphemism, placeholder, rallying cry, and Rorschach test, despite, and perhaps because of, its multiplicity of meanings. Policy discussions that purport to focus on the impact that unauthorized migrant laborers may have on domestic workers, on unemployment rates, on the availability of finite social and economic resources for all who need them within a territory, and on the impact of migration on the social and cultural fabric of the nation, often invoke or critique the concept with an astonishing lack of focus or precision. Though rather technical legal constructs usually undergird such debates, public discourse routinely takes on a tenor of rough morality, differentiating behaviors and practices that should be rewarded, such as staying in the queue or entering the country legally, from those that presumably deserve penalty, such as jumping the queue or sneaking into the country illegally. But in most legal arenas, illegality is not generally understood as an existential condition. Indeed, outside of immigration law, one is hard-pressed to find examples, though there are some. Actually, the highly charged classification of sex offenders is an analogy that we could talk about. The reasons for this are deep and fundamental. To accept the idea of illegal people is inevitably to risk accepting dangerous forms of castes. As the Supreme Court noted in the 1982 case that held that the undocumented children of undocumented non-citizens in Texas had a right to public school education. That case was called Plyler versus Doe. 5-4 decision. It was close, but the court upheld their rights, and the court wrote, quote, "Sheer incapability or lax enforcement of the laws barring entry into this country, coupled with the failure to establish an effective bar to the employment of undocumented aliens, has led to the creation of a substantial shadow population within our borders." The court recognized explicitly that this situation raised, quote, "the specter of a permanent caste of undocumented resident aliens, and that such a, quote, underclass presents most difficult problems for a nation that prides itself on adherence to principles of equality under law," end quote. So as Roberto Suro from USC and Marcelo Suarez Orozco from UCLA wrote in Monday's New York Times, I just want to end with this because I thought it was quite an interesting op-ed. The title is "No Papers, It's the Kids Who Suffer." Quote, "Something happened while the immigration system in the United States got broken. Something that should change the way we talk about fixing it. Years went by and nature took its course. More than 11 million unauthorized immigrants settled into our communities. Many formed families and had children. Now, at least 1 of every 15 children living in the United States has an unauthorized parent, and nearly all of those children are native-born United States citizens. Think of that statistic, 1 in 15, the next time you drive by a school or a playground. Think of those children living with the knowledge that the federal government can take their parents away. Common sense tells you that the threat of a parent's deportation will exact a terrible price." I'll end on that note, and hopefully we can talk more about this. Thank you.
Well, with two such brilliant minds, I want to get to the question and answers, but I've been asked to say a few words before then. So let me begin with a quote, if I might. Martin Luther King, "One who breaks an unjust law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for law." I think that we've a book in front of us that really struggles with respecting the law, and respecting the law, recognizing the law can be wrong. It's a tough place to enter, tough part of the dialogue. So I have a formal statement that, lest anybody needs to quote me, the book's an invitation to conscience. We're presented a case in the development of egregious law. Before our eyes, during our lifetime, during the last decades, we've watched a slow and steady redefinition of lawful and unlawful, of criminality. And this change of definitions, used as a political tool for the harm of migrants. We can discuss and debate immigration, migration flow policy, even the defendability of borders by sovereign nations. But what we have on these pages is an indictment of our democracy that prides itself in being a nation under law, a land united by a just system of governance and self-control. The criminalization of those who in prior decades were merely civil trespassers in non-felony actions is a threat not only to individuals caught in the legal web, but it's a threat to our democracy. 9 other quick points. We are a nation of laws, and we do have to revise and change laws that result in unjust treatment. At the heart of this is the dehumanization of neighbors, and I think the book is a remarkable accomplishment in being able to address the potential dehumanization and abuses that come from ill-conceived law and poorly executed policy. My third point, Ford, we should thank, because they brought you together in the original workshop and symposium, and they did it, I think...
Foundation, not the...
Ford Foundation, yes. Well, what's wonderful is that they brought together, in your vision, a multidisciplinary team. I think it's an unjust issue if we look at illegality as a legal issue. It's wonderful that we teach this in the School of Social Work and in School of Education as well as in the School of Law here at Boston College, because we are recognizing, I sense, that we need multiple lenses to be able to get this in focus. We can't see it through any one discipline. And it's incredibly important for us, I think, to recognize that the human rights issue, well, legal issue, but the human dimensions of personal suffering and struggle and definition of family, of search for hope and for perseverance and for human potential are things that draw the rest of us into the story and allow us to participate very fully, I think, in a drama that's being acted out around us and with us. We need the perspective of moral theologians. David, you should have been a part of this book. And we need as well, I think, constitutional scholars. Dan will be a constitutional scholar next year, so he takes on the new field. But one of the things that is critical to me is that we can't take it from one perspective, and the book is wonderful for giving you a variety of academic perspectives. Fourth point, I think the book should be renamed. I renamed it for you, if you want to sell it. So my title for the book is 50 Shades of Blue. It's a little more demonic than erotic, but I do think it has the potential of arousing passions. And the passions that it arouses are, for any of us who care about human welfare, how can we possibly look at this condition and come away unmoved? The book invites us to enter into the struggle and into the suffering and into the questions and into the ambiguity and even into the legal vagueness in a way that doesn't leave us disempowered, but invites us to intellectually become sophisticated participants in the democracy. A vital contribution, and one that I respect and appreciate. And I think that it invites us also to ask ourselves the question of, who's served by enforcement that stereotypes or asks for papers or uses jails and dehumanizes millions of our neighbors? How do defenders of justice uphold the law when the law offers no remedy or pathway or hope? Fifth point, there's not a summary of the broad sociological consequences in this book, and I would like to have had more of that, especially with your disciplines and knowing how much you've written in other places. So we'll have to read your other books to get all the dimensions that are part of your expertise. But in a recent piece of mine, I wrote about the 51st state of the United States, the borderlands, which have, as I perceive it, and I take a class down from the School of Social Work, is a police state, as close as I've seen it, at least in North America. A remarkable place where anybody can be stopped, and particularly stopped because you're brown. And everyone can be asked for papers. And I was driving down the road the other day, coming up from Patagonia, and I followed the behavior of the car in front of me rolling through it was 25 miles away from the border, rolling through a border patrol stop where they do random checks. And I did what the car in front of me did. I just slowed down, I waved, I kept going, and he pulled the gun on me. 20-year-old aiming an AK-47 in my head was not a happy experience. This is my country. And that's what I said to him. I opened the window and I said, "Excuse me, young man, but that is inappropriate. This is my country and you work for me." I said, "I hope that somebody challenges your behavior." At which point he called over other people who wanted to surround the car. Don't talk back to people with guns. The police state shows itself in many other forms in that area of the world, and you touch on it, but the social manifestation of this, I think, is yet the next dimension to carry on as we think about what's happened, because the ranchers hate the border patrol and the customs people because they drive over the fences, they ignore their crops, they ignore their herds, the elderly are afraid to go to the store or open their door. Even when they call for a repairman, they're afraid to open the door if he's a Latino to come and fix their roof, because they live in the sense of fear that's propagated that there is somehow an attack that's affecting everyone's welfare. This is a huge problem, and the consequence of having constructed immigrant illegality to the degree that's pictured in the pages of this book. Sixth point, in social work, we need more attention to the human price of illegality. I think students need the book. I'm already using, Dan, your work on, in some ways that was probably preceded this, or may have been what you presented in San Francisco. But I think it's critically important in whatever one of our disciplines that we're working in here at the university that we take time to add this to our academic syllabus. We need to study the book to understand social dynamics that make the poor poorer and the weak weaker. we need to look at the ways in which a community becomes fractured, to discover ways in which prejudice becomes policy, and look very seriously at the way in which the problem of those who came across the border is an excuse for the industrialization of an industry that's meant to suppress and threaten. The consequences of social isolation, fear, going from stigma to exclusion, from separated families to incarcerated indigents, systems that are almost inconceivable to the American democracy, the human harm that's done daily, all with the sense of pride, political muscle, rationalization that should offend us, if not challenge us to action. Seventh point in reading this. Dan tells me I may be the only person who's read the book yet. The facts that fill these pages are wonderful. There are just an incredible array of important facts. Now, I like Doug Massey's book, is it Moon and Shadows?
Beyond Smoke and Mirrors.
Yeah, Beyond Smoke and Mirrors. Because he lays out the history of the policy. But this history you were talking about is really important for us to get. We can't talk about this issue without understanding some of the history, understanding the facts, seeing how big this problem is. It is big. You can't talk about 11 million people and dismiss it. But when I read the book, I don't want to be objective. You try very nicely to give us a good, as academics should, the facts. I read this and I want to scream. I'm outraged. I find myself moved and motivated, and I hope other people who read this find themselves brought the same way. So just one set of facts, for instance. You talk about the detention system. Well, the CCA and the GEO are the two big companies that control the private detention system in America. They have 67% of all the detention beds in the United States are operated by these two companies. They had a profit last year of $338 million from taxpayers for running, at the supposed behest of the public, detention centers. They spent almost $10 million in Washington of your money and my money to ask Congress two things. They want more detention beds, and they want longer stays in detention. Who's driving policy? Who's driving policy? I think that's the stuff that we're brought to the cusp of that. But the question of how we wrestle with it, what we do with it, how outraged we ought to be by these kinds of facts is up to us as we read it. The warden in Florence said to my class when we were there this year that it's necessary to have detention centers to assure us that these migrants will go to court. Don Kerwin, on the other hand, the same week was releasing a study saying 95% of people who are supposed to show up at court do voluntarily. So we have facts totally dismissed, and I hope the book and the factual base that's here is something that policymakers will read and take into consideration. Obviously, we share a worldview, and that is that if we took everything that was considered a civil case and turned it into a felony, we would have a society bereft of almost all of us. If every deadbeat dad, every taxpayer who failed to pay their taxes, every trespasser, every company who fired somebody, perhaps with prejudice, was put in jail or considered a criminal, was treated as a felon, we would have one thing in common. We'd be seeing each other behind bars. My eighth point, the book calls the nation to account for ill-conceived and politicized law, injustice, and its many aspects which are described. I think the challenge of finding solutions is something you bring us to a wonderful place of wrestling with what's brought us to this place. Do we know the answer? I'm not sure we answer it here, but we wrestle with the possibilities of what should be, what could be. So for all of us, we have to find some ways of thinking about being solution-oriented. How do we correct the law? How do we address the injustices that surround it? I suspect any class at MIT could design a bracelet that looked a little like a Fitbit, that was not removable, that could take the place of the scarlet letter that we've created for those who have anklets that they have to wear. But the anklet's only $14 a day compared to $161 a day in a detention center, and there is no reason for the $161. We have an array of options available even in the enforcement side if you would allow these laws to stand and treat them as being somehow appropriate. We need to wrestle long and hard with the questions that are raised in the book, and I challenge you guys as academics to continue writing and working on that, and to as you speak, to arouse all of us to think with you and alongside of our elected officials of what we're going to do to address this kind of question. What are our best options?
Here comes one now.
A little spooky.
How did that happen?
Ninth point, underchart off the New Bedford raid was our biggest sort of moment in terms of looking at illegality, getting the public attention. The garment workers in New Bedford were making military vests, and they came in and arrested 350 people, and it was an abomination. Mothers with nursing babies were taken away and thrown into detention centers in Texas. We had pregnant women taken, who people couldn't find for days, trying to figure out where they were. Yeah, it was horrific. So what they did as a result of that is call for humanitarian guidelines. Well, the question is that once you get into the subject, is it sufficient for us to say we have humanitarian guidelines? I don't think so. But I do suggest that part of the conversation that needs to happen is what should be the guidelines for the treatment of people who are being arrested by ICE, and how do we deal with that responsibly? A lot of references to this, but not particularly coming to the point of asking what we can do. And certainly one of the things we need to do is to codify those humanitarian recommendations into law and that they expand on them. And I think we need to find ways to take the principles of what we do, because that set of guidelines only calls for what happens when there's over 150 people that are arrested in a raid. But what happens when it's 25 people and it's the same human condition? There's a number of incredibly important, urgent issues to address. We had a recent change in policy with PEP, and we followed PEP, PEP, which is the Priority Enforcement Program. It calls for a shift in arresting, so that now it's not just when you go in and get fingerprinted that ICE gets notified or there's an order for deportation. Now there's a notification for deportation only if there's a conviction. This is a huge step and improvement. But when you go into the detention centers in Florence and across this country, there are detention centers everywhere, one of the frightening things is to hear the stories of those who are there and realize their sense of total confusion and their misunderstanding and their lack of feeling that they are criminals in any size, shape, or form, trying to figure out how to deal with a situation which they cannot comprehend. We really have to find a way to deal with the foreign-born residents and save them from mistreatment. The Trust Act in Boston is an example of a positive urban response, and I think we need much more of many more actions like that. I spoke in Milan last year, Dan, and I tried to do the same thing you just did, which is give a little history. I found doing Google search, word searches, that the point when the American conversation went to illegality was a speech by Ronald Reagan in 1986. And he was talking about the feet people. We already had the boat people. But then he said that there would be a horde of feet people surging across the border to flee communism in our southern neighbors. This is the same president who was doing one of the greatest amnesties in American history. So my suspicion is that it was a political balancing act. He was doing the good thing over here, let's normalize them, let's give them amnesty. And on the other side, he's doing political rhetoric that was blaming and creating a little fear and worry. Not maybe just a little. Border Patrol starts doing a whole lot of operations then along the border to turn back immigrants coming back to do the harvest. And the situation there has never turned back. We've had just a consistent deluge of terms of illegality and all kinds of its similar metaphors and languages. This kind of thing, unfortunately, and the Human Rights Center, I think, is a perfect place for this to find a home in BC. When I was in Europe, I pointed out the fact that right now Lega Nord is the political party in part of northern Italy. They're using the language taken from our political right to describe immigration. And when you go to Europe and you realize that these welfare states that have been so generous and so humanitarianly oriented have now adopted the language of illegality. This is new for them within 5 years. And it's really grabbing hold of sort of the worst of us. We're not exporting human rights. We're exporting ideologies of blame and coercion and threat that are frightful. And it is unfortunately electing a lot of right-wing political parties across Europe. Well, it brings me back to the BC context. I was reading the words of a Jesuit, former Jesuit, who's living in Rome these days. I hear he's been invited to speak to the US Congress in September when he comes. Pope Francis wrote to a group, much like my BC class, who joined me at the Kino project in Nogales, Mexico this last January. He wrote to these young people and about them. These young people who have come to learn how to strive against the propagation of stereotypes from people who only see an immigration as a source of illegality, social conflict, and violence, can contribute much to show the world a church without borders. Never tire of working to build fraternity and welcome against discrimination and exclusion. To that I say amen. And to the authors I say congratulations, a remarkable contribution in a world I'm quite convinced needs the book, but where the book speaks to a void in our community and legal and social work understandings. Thank you.
Now I'd like to invite all three of our speakers to join me up here and to open the conversation to the rest of you. Thank you.
Actually, I want to do one little chart.
Are you
before we
doing
do
this?
that. No, just this. It occurred to me that there's something that would be worth pointing out.
Is there a better marker?
Here, try this one, Dave.
I'm going to leave it to the experts in the room to put numbers on this, but I thought it was worth pointing something out, which is 1965 was the year when U.S. immigration laws changed dramatically and actually allowed for a certain type of Western Hemisphere immigration, but in fact closed what had been an open border in the Western Hemisphere and subjected Mexicans and Central Americans to quotas, which had never been the case before. And I just want to show you, this is without putting numbers on it, but roughly, this would be approximately the trend line of deportation in this country. It's sort of flat. Just around the time when the cohort of people from this period are starting to come of age as young men, we start to see a sharp uptick, a very sharp uptick. And again, if I put numbers on here, it would be going up to the millions towards the end, from very few thousands in the 1960s. At the same time, you could do two other trend lines that would be pretty much exactly the same. And again, without putting numbers on it, you can check me on this one, get the numbers. One would be the general numbers of incarceration of African American men and people of color generally, the so-called prison industrial complex. It's almost an exact parallel if you follow the numbers. And the other is felony disenfranchisement of African American men, the stripping of the rights of citizens for those who have been criminalized through drug policies. These things go together, I think. So that's part of, when you talk about the history, that was a piece that I didn't get to mention. And thank you, Westy, for those kind of words. I'm offended that you only had 9 comments. That's a hardcover book.
I know how much you would have to say there. I didn't want to.
It's coming out in paperback.
You've been too quiet, so you should
Yes.
do twice as many things.
No, but the first thing is hardcover, but it's coming out in paperback in 2 weeks. We thought it was going to be available today.
And they're taking pre-orders at 20% off.
Oh, there you go.
And then there's the motion picture. Who's playing you?
I don't know, we'll see this one,
Yes.
Questions, comments?
Hello. This is probably more directed towards Cecilia. I am really interested in, I actually read a couple of your articles on intimate partner violence in the context of undocumented women. But this question, I'm really appreciative of kind of the spin that you guys have on this whole question of illegality, particularly this idea of an existential condition, and how that is experienced day to day, because a lot of what I do in social work is kind of see the day to day and what that means, like psychodynamically and psychologically for people. So I don't know if you have any insight about that, but what I've been seeing a lot is a lot of my clients and people in my family and people in my community have said these same words to me over the course of my life. Of, if I knew that this is what America was like, I wouldn't have come here. And so I think a lot about kind of in the context of American exceptionalism, also thinking about the immigrant paradox, how so many first-generation immigrants are incredibly resilient, don't have a lot of the same psychiatric problems that people in the US have.
another, yes, there is work on how immigrants respond, and on the positive side, showing how they are still able to keep families, they are still able to participate in communities. The work of Sebastian Chauvin, he's done his work in Europe, but his argument is that even without papers, even without being formally recognized by the state, people continue to be active participants in their communities, in their neighborhoods, in their families, and in the labor force. They are civically engaged, and so he focuses on all of the participatory aspects of living in illegality. And so there is work on that. And he's a sociologist. In my work, I have tended to focus on the effects that are not only the negative effects, but I focus on sort of the complexity of effects that living. And when we talk about living in not a condition, but a category of illegality, I also want to emphasize that, and this comes from people I have interviewed. This is not my own reading or it comes from the literature. That this it is not being undocumented or documented, but being in increasingly more uncertain legal statuses. Because it's not just a black and white, undocumented or documented. This is where we can talk about data. This is where we can talk about all the new legal statuses that are created that are pushing more people into legal uncertainty. And I think that's something that we sometimes, but this is in the book. We have a big section on that because it is, and it is also with a labor economist colleague of mine, we're writing about this new normal that is immigration reform, for instance. One of the more serious attempts at a proposal for comprehensive immigration reform from the senator. One of the main propositions there is to grant temporary status to people who can demonstrate, who are deserving of more inclusion. But the move to more temporary statuses, and so it's not only some people who don't have documents at all, but it's people who also are not fully integrated, and who are in uncertain legal statuses. And so there is some literature on how people are able to cope with living in uncertainty, but I focus more on the complexity of the variety of legal statuses, of uncertain legal statuses.
Let me follow up on this point about uncertainty. I think is a very important one. And this may sound a little cynical or a little proto-Marxist to some of you, but let me just risk it. Let's imagine that your goal was to develop a system of, let's call it social control, to take a group of laborers and render them as malleable, as pliable, as docile as you could. What kind of a system would you develop? Well, I think you would develop a system of pervasive uncertainty, where you would say, there is the sword of Damocles hangs over your head every day. If you step out of line, then it's going to fall on you. If you play ball, it's not going to fall on you. You organize labor unions, I can call immigration at a moment's notice, for example. So this system, which in one sense seems like a historical accident maybe, or an artifact, or a peculiar development that depends on certain idiosyncratic facts of history, has a very deep rationality to it from the perspective of employers, particularly in the Southwest, And I think that's an important consideration because law does not develop independently of those kind of factors. So this uncertainty is not just an effect, it actually may be the central purpose of the deportation regime over labor in the Southwest. Now, in other parts of the country, it doesn't have that same rationality. It doesn't seem quite as specific. But if you go to where the people are harvesting the lettuce and the grapes, it's very clear to understand what the difference is. And Cesar Chavez understood that completely. Now, this raises some complicated policy questions about how one ought to respond to it, but I just want to point out that this uncertainty is a deep, it does have this rationality.
Can you just clarify, based on your comments, with the uncertainty that people have been experiencing, lately has been related to heightened enforcement and the border moving inward, but there hasn't been a sweeping overhaul and kind of citizenship granting since 1986, right? So
You mean a legalization program?
legalization, so uncertain status has been around for a long time for people. It's just more the enforcement operation that's happening that's creating uncertainty about whether you'll be able to stay here, come out of the shadows or not, right? Or how do you
No, I think actually the enforcement of, as you may know, I differentiate the two types of deportation, and the one that we're talking about now is the what I call the extended border control variant of people who entered illegally or who are out of status. The uncertainty of that has been around, since the 70s and 80s. And if anything, that's diminished a little bit in the Obama administration, which has taken this turn towards focusing on the bad ones. That's why they talk about, families, not felons. And we should talk about that because I think there are deep problems with that construction also. But no, I don't think that there has been, if anything, actually, enforcement has gotten less as against workers. I mean, during the Bush administration, there was this major uptick in raids. Has that really reduced uncertainty? Has that really reduced stress among the undocumented population? Not so far as I can tell. I mean, I think people feel like there might be some possibilities now, but then to have something like DAPA, the thing, this follow-up for families, given and then suddenly taken away because a Bush appointee federal judge in Texas comes up with a theory of administrative law, that's pretty cruel. Now, I think there's a different logic to that. It's not quite the same as the employer logic that created the system in the first place. But it's part of the explanation of why isn't it just going away? Why is there such resistance to this granting of an amnesty? I think that goes to the needs of the labor market as much as anything else, and race.
In the multiplication of similar statuses of uncertainty that we see across the board in employment, across the family and temporary protected statuses that are meant to be temporary, that are meant to keep people in living illegality for decades.
I mean, not to be too facile about it, but I think generally speaking, people with security and power like to keep other people in conditions of uncertainty and relative tenuous.
And I think it's always worth putting in the other side of that conversation because when you reach 11 million undocumented people in the country, it's a destabilizing factor. And it's not surprising that the right has taken it on as an issue. We need to recognize that there is a sociological dis-ease with this phenomenon. If it was 3 million people, there'd be no political power in this conversation. So part of what's happened is this rapid rise that did take place over the same period we're looking at in this chart on the wall. When you have numbers go like this, there's a feeling of loss of control, there's a feeling of political reaction, and unfortunately the political reactions are just not well founded or thought through well, so we find ourselves dealing with bad law. But I'm not sure it's unjustified that there's a civic debate over the problem.
I have a list of hands here, so.
One of the things I teach this class called States, Markets, and Bodies, and one of the things that I was thinking about with this chart that you put up was, I wanted to ask you how, what's similar and what's different about policing of citizens, particularly African Americans versus non-citizens, and it's something I haven't been able to parse out in my own sort of thinking, but the policing styles, one would, in your book, sort of Aftermath, you talk about how there's no due process, And what we're seeing in Baltimore right now, actually, for citizens, there's similarly no due process, not just Baltimore, but my partner is working on this piece right now that's a national data set of city governments. And what he's finding is that with an increase in immigration, there's also an increase in city expenditures on policing. And so I'm wondering, what are the parallels and where do they, converge and diverge on how they police African Americans versus undocumented?
I just read a study, and I'm blanking on the author's name, because maybe you know that I never read this before. Is somebody from Ohio State and I think Purdue, 3 sociologists tried to disaggregate criminal sentencing data, where there's long been evidence of racial disparities, and then there are ethnic disparities too, like a Hispanic penalty as compared to white people. They tried to disaggregate that from citizenship status, and they actually found that non-citizenship, lack of citizenship status, is even more predictive of sentencing disparity than either race or ethnicity. And they hypothesized that part of the reason for that, and this is something I've actually said in other places, is that in a way it's the last legitimate discrimination. It's like nobody is allowed to discriminate anymore on the basis of race or ethnicity. You certainly can't say it. But you can say it's legitimate to discriminate on citizenship grounds because, after all, that's the law. So it has inherent legitimacy to it. And that's not to say that that legitimacy isn't partly real. But when you look at how it's deployed and the effect that it has on the ground, it causes you to question, how people are actually using that. Another way to think about this is I always wonder, why does everybody get so excited about people who have violated federal law by coming here to work, and not so excited about millions of people who have also violated federal law by keeping home offices that they're improperly deducting on their taxes, just for example. I mean, this country is full of people who are violating federal law all the time. Every university probably has dozens of people who are illegally claiming home offices. Go after them. What part of illegal do they not understand? I don't know if that's responsive. Sorry, it probably isn't responsive.
The incarceration aspect, I think is very interesting because of the chart that you just put up. The incarceration of and detention of undocumented immigrants and the incarceration of African American men. I think there are very close parallels. So there are some differences because of everything you said, but there are also some interesting and important parallels.
I mean, I think that the parallels would be harder to draw if it weren't also obvious that the vast, vast, vast majority of people who are deported are young men of color. I mean, that is just a ground level fact that I think cannot be said to be a coincidence, that this started happening around the same time. That's not to say that all people who enforce immigration laws are racist. It's not to say that all people who say, as you said, that it's legitimate to have a debate about the fact that federal law has been violated. I think that debate is legitimate. It's not necessarily a racist debate. But when you look at the enforcement patterns and the history of it, I just think it's hard to get away from it. So, I mean, you still look like
I guess
you're
I just don't. I guess I'm still trying to parse out what's similar and what's different because
not,
federal law
between what and what?
between the treatment of undocumented migrants and citizens, African American citizens.
In the criminal justice. So
Yeah,
what's similar is that it's a system of police power that's exercised against a discrete and insular minority that is largely defined by race or ethnicity. That's what's similar. What's different is the nature of the laws that are alleged to have been violated and certain background assumptions about whether it's a criminal process or a civil process. What is also different is the consequences of it. Incarceration is different from banishment. Ironically, the penalty that's inflicted on people being deported is often harsher than the penalty on people who are in prison. But I would say that, to my mind, the functional sort of Foucault-like similarities viewed in that way outweigh the differences in what we are talking about. And when I do a PowerPoint on this, I have a chart that says we should understand deportation as being about much more than immigration control. It's these trends are related. And I can trace the history of the deportation system back to roots that go back to the fugitive slave laws. I mean, there were functional similarities between those systems of massive federal bureaucracies that were designed to arrest, again, young men of color across state lines and remove them to other places. I mean, that is a very powerful functional similarity. I don't think that's a facile analogy.
I think if we think of the world of welfare regimes also, that the nature of a welfare regime is to determine what's cost effective in the commodification of humankind, right? We're only valuable to the society as workers. And then we develop exclusionary policy, so our investment is limited to those who are most valuable to the system that we're trying to protect and maintain. So almost inevitably in those systems, there are people who are defined as a them to be excluded because it's cost effective. We find ourselves, even though we're spending a lot of money on costs in prisons, we find ourselves punishing anybody who might want to participate in the welfare that we meant to design for ourselves and not for a them, whoever the them is. Immigrants are an easy mark on that, right? Because they're outside that.
Yeah,
But it extends back into minorities as well.
Ask questions. If you could direct your question to one of our speakers, and then we could come back around. Gabby.
Okay, cool. Cecilia, you mentioned earlier that it's important also to take into account people's responses to this category of illegality that's been constructed. And going back to the previous topic about temporal status that has been granted more recently, and how this creates uncertainty, I was wondering how, what insights you may have on how the temporary statuses that are being granted have an impact on the way people respond, and the responses in terms of resisting or conforming to this new category.
Yes, I think the responses vary, even not just between the responses for people who have been given temporary statuses and those who haven't, but even within people who have been given temporary statuses. For instance, the DACA recipients, the movement, the DACA movement, they have pushed for so much. I think it is these DACA recipients are people who have been members of society in everything except for the one legal recognition. And so they have learned what to expect also in terms of their rights, in terms of what they should be, as members of society, they should be entitled to. With respect to people, for instance, in temporary protected status, these are adults who came, who have been extended a work permit. What the temporary permit creates in their minds is the expectation that this may at some point turn into something permanent. And so that has an impact on how people respond, because having temporary protected status, it's sort of a hopeful state that people think that at some point this may change, and it can only change for the best, because changing in the opposite direction is just unthinkable. So I think it creates very different responses, given the experiences people have had in society through institutions that they have been part of. DACA, we have that example. It's even for people who are in those temporary statuses, the responses may be different because of the exposure they've had with different institutions in society.
But let me problematize that a little bit, because I totally support DACA and the regularization of people looking out of status because of how long they've been here. But if you go down the road, too far down this other road, and say any temporary status is illegitimate and unfair because people always have expectations to the contrary, that is true. But if you take that proposition too seriously, you will eliminate the possibility of governments having temporary statuses. And temporary status is a very important piece of the human rights regime historically, to allow refugees to have temporary safe haven. No, because otherwise governments wouldn't agree to it if they thought that temporary has to always mean permanent. So I think this really is a policy dilemma that governments have to figure out. And I would suggest the way to solve this is through the rule of law and through a proportional balancing test that can be done for particular cases. That after a certain period of time, or after accruing a certain amount of equities, a person might have a viable claim to come into court and say, I should be given an exception to the temporary status, so that the longer governments allow these temporary statuses to continue, or the less clear they are about it, the more they incur responsibility for the human consequences that develop. But I don't think I would agree that temporary statuses are always illegitimate.
Right. I think the point is the length of time people spend in temporary statuses. Because the 340,000 people on temporary protected status right now, 25,000 are Salvadorians who have held that status since 2001. They're going to be on this status for 15 years. So I think, for instance, a temporary status for refugees don't spend 15 years waiting to see what happens with their lives.
Challenge that. 8 million of the 12 million refugees who are under UNHCR's care have been warehoused in refugee camps around the world and have no option of leaving.
These people
So
are
it's a
3
temporary-
generations
Yes.
of refugees.
It's temporary. It's just not temporary in employment or in normalization.
Yeah, and so in here.
So it does
in the United
exist in lots of
States-
forms, right?
Yes.
There are 2 more. You had a question and then David. Yes.
So my question has to do with, so I guess this room is full of a lot of students. I'm a student of sociology myself, and I am totally embedded and dedicated to this issue and working and speaking and being friends with and being part of families who are mixed statuses and who are undocumented. So my question is, so as I'm doing this research and as I'm realizing all of these things and these things are coming out from stories that I hear in the communities here in Boston, what do I do with that information? Okay, I can write my nice dissertation or my research paper, but as I think especially in sociology, there's always a challenge of how do you make your work apply, and I want to know, and maybe Dr. Menjívar, you would be the best to answer this, being a sociologist, but how do I make my work apply? What do I do, especially given the challenges of things people have told me where, because they're undocumented, there is this huge fear of how to kind of make their voices heard also. So how do I play a role in that? How do we all play a role in that?
I think one way is to, and it's incremental and it's in sort of patchwork kind of way, in different circles. You can make sure that your work is in some way reaches policymakers, even if they don't pay attention, but at least someone, if it's distributed among, if you write a report and it's distributed in 100 offices, maybe one person in one office will read it and will pay attention and will keep that information. In this context right now, it's very tough, but I think it is, especially if you have information, if you have data, the data that you're collecting will benefit people in one way. I think it's almost your responsibility to make sure that that information gets disseminated to circles beyond academia. And it's almost not a choice, it's a responsibility that you owe to the people in your studies, but also to the people who need to be informed, because they may not know simply. If they were better informed, maybe policies would be different. And so I think it's difficult, but there are different channels, reports that can be circulated in Washington. Again, it sounds like, but it will pay attention. But someone may actually read the whole thing and may pay attention.
Well, I can also say that, this debate has been remarkably stamped by bad information and myths and false factual claims. So it is really important to get good data out there, and we need sociologists and demographers and social sciences generally to get out there. It has made a big difference when a couple of sociologists first started calculating whether immigrants actually committed more crimes than citizens. When Reagan was talking about this in 1986, he was accompanied by Alphonse D'Amato, a Neanderthal senator from Long Island, who said, that was his party. His famous line was that immigrants were savaging our society. And it was conventional wisdom that crime was caused by immigrants. And then sociologists investigated. It turns out it wasn't only not true, it was the complete opposite was true, that actually citizenship status was a greater predictor of crime. So that's one example. I mean, we really need the data. The other thing is, let me introduce you to Jessica Kiko over here, who works with us at the Post-Deportation Human Rights Project. We are working now on a declaration on the rights of deported people that is, again, in need of support from social science data. And we're doing research through the center, Brinton and I and others, about what are the effects of deportation on families, on children. I think this can have a very powerful impact, and I think the key is, as Cecilia said, to stay engaged with activists, not to be separated from them, but to be a clear, rational voice with good data. It's a tremendous opportunity.
And I'll encourage you by saying the question's great. Having advised the governor, 5 governors, the absence of academic material on the Hill would be enough to overwhelm you. I've never seen an academic paper in the hands of a politician. Now, they all have policy directors. Policy directors actually look for resources. So you want to befriend some people. And if you answer real questions, the important thing is not to answer your own question, is to try to ask what questions are being asked in political circles that you can address. Those things do get read and used. I'll be with 175 people in the White House this summer. There will only be 2 academics in the crowd, and I consider myself a very low-level academic. I'm a late-life academic who doesn't have the credentials of these guys. But in the world of that meeting, academics aren't invited because they're considered elite and irrelevant to the conversation. They don't know how to apply their knowledge. But those who do apply the knowledge, who are at Brookings, who are working at MPI, they're loved. They're welcomed into the conversation.
Okay, here we have David over here, and then I'll take you as the final question.
I'd like to ask this. I'm not sure exactly who. Maybe Dan, maybe Cecilia. You can see whoever. But you know, your title of constructing illegality. Dan traced some of the history there about how the notion of illegality really emerges in the mid 60s or post-Bracero program, where at least becomes much more stressed at that point. And those graphs you draw there. You get a big surge in the 80s about deportation and so forth. I guess what I'm interested in, this may not be the right analogy, but if we were to use a sort of medical analogy, if we were to consider the vast uncertainty that people face when they're without documents due to the threat of deportation to be a kind of disease that's affecting their lives. Overcoming the disease is going to mean knowing what some or at least the major cause of this surge of constructing illegality and then threatening people with deportation. Is there a way to get at some analysis of a cause of all of this change that's led us from seeing this as basically managing a labor situation to becoming a really serious illegal problem, that we could find a way to address the deeper cause of why this problem has emerged to the degree that it has only in the last, say, 3 or 4 decades?
Well, let me reframe the question in one small way, which
illustrates
why I felt so privileged to work with Cecilia on this. I think there are actually 2 separate questions that are often conflated, and I'd like to separate them out. One is, what is the cause of the rise of undocumented workers and this unregulated labor market? So that's one question. That's a historical question. It's a question of demographic facts, and I think we can offer answers, and I tried to offer some. The other question, though, is it's a matter of ideology and rhetoric, which is the concomitant rise of the idea of the illegal immigrant as a trope, as a meme, as something that achieved a life of its own. And actually, those 2 things I think are very different questions. And that's what I like about this book, is that we tried to sort of get at both of those things from different angles and see how is this idea of illegality, the idea of illegality, how is it lived, how do people internalize it, how do other people deploy it? I mean, politicians, you know, use it in really venal ways routinely because it's such a lovely trope, and that gets back to the idea that it's like the last legitimate form of discrimination. So I think we need to answer those questions separately. I think the book is more about the second question than the first one.
Okay.
And I'll turn to Cecilia because her work is more precise on this than mine.
Yes, no, but I agree that the book is more about the second question. And we tried actually, when we started thinking about the book, one idea was to debunk, and we actually use, we have in the introduction, we approach it very directly as trying to debunk this term and the way it's being used ideologically. So that's
Well, if you take the second question about the ideological use of this term, can you give some rough guess of what the reason for the emergence of that ideology
Absolutely,
is?
there's no question. Unscrupulous politicians, I mean, it's Willie Horton. It's exact, and it was the same historical period, it was the same people. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
and it's easy. It's easy. It's
Okay.
very efficient, convenient, efficient, because
And it
in
feels
one
legitimate, it's the
term-
perfect epithet.
With one term, you can stop questions about why we should mistreat people because they are breaking the law.
But would there
And
been
so-
a reason for unscrupulous politicians to do this in the 1940s instead of in the 19...
No, because in the
80s?
1940s we needed Mexican laborers during the
Okay,
Second World
okay,
War.
so-
In the 30s, we just deported them en masse, you know, millions of them,
Okay.
and there was similar rhetoric used
Okay,
by
I got you.
California politicians in the 30s. So each historical period has their own version of this.
All right.
But in historical periods where the urge for deportation becomes stronger for various other reasons, the rhetoric tends to follow. But this particular rhetorical trope is a brilliant construction. I mean, I really...
So it really is a matter of using it for social control then, and to keep economic resources under the thumb of those who resort.
Well, also, I think it's a Jedi mind trick, you know, if you want to go back to an old
Okay.
reference. Because once people start using that term, they lose the ability to think critically about what's really happening, because suddenly you have this category of people who bear illegality in their very essence. And once you start thinking of people like that,
Yeah.
then you don't take seriously their claims to justice because they're primarily lawbreakers. That's why it's such a brilliant idea, and it harnesses the idea of the rule of law, which, as you know, has ameliorative and humanitarian
All
and
sorts of
moral
good ideas
components.
in it, yeah.
It ignores those components using an implicit binary conception of law in order to marginalize people. That's the
and
brilliance of
it's
it.
naturalized. It's natural. It's everything's
Yeah,
stuff.
interesting.
So you had a question, and then the last one's back here.
Well, I just kind of, going back to your comment about what can we do, and these last comments that you were making about how illegality is a form of, it makes it easy not to question what's going on, and that's what we need to be doing, is questioning, and as citizens, we have a status and a privilege that people who are undocumented don't have, and it's going to require people who don't have that fear of being deported to stand up and say, this is wrong. And people, the country of the United States prides itself on being the land of the free and the home of the brave, but we never have been. I mean, our country was founded on slavery and has been, using an exploited labor system ever since then. I mean, it was the Chinese, it was the Irish, it was, now it's people of Mexico and Central America. It's just crazy. And so until there's a more social consciousness among the everyday citizenry, how are we going to change that system? That's what it's really going to take.
Yeah,
It's
and let me-
people standing together and saying, we're not going to let other people be treated this way.
I think one last point that I would just leave you to think about is, in many ways, many people have felt that the most brilliant antidote to the illegal alien trope was the movement of the dreamers. because there you had people who were so untouchable as being sympathetic and good people and achievers, and who could, you know, of course they're amazing strivers and great people. And yet, the difficulty of that, as many immigrant activists have noticed, is that in some ways it buys into the same duality, the idea that there are good ones and there are bad ones. And I think the ultimate task here is to get beyond that kind of thinking, which is not to criticize the Dreamers or anything. I mean, I totally support that movement, but the danger of that rhetoric is that it can also ostracize those who are not quite that good. And so we've fallen into this trap of differentiating the good from the bad people, as opposed to understanding the more complex reality of people's lives. But that's a hard sell, and it needs, again, more sociologists.
Final question, yes.
But it's from something earlier, it just makes me wonder, how is our situation, what are the similarities and differences from what's going on around the world, or what's going on for centuries? I read in the New York Times the wall in Bulgaria to keep out the Turks is now rivaling the Rio Grande. You have Italy worry, all the furor about the migrants coming from Libya, all the worries in France about you're ruining all the immigration issues in Israel. Hasn't the word barbarian always meant the foreigner?
There are 11 walls around the world that represent those kind of border issues. And I think you're right if your point is that this has historically been from the Great Wall of China to today, an effort to figure out how to keep people out that we don't want to have in. But I don't think that changes the dynamics of trying to figure out how we do just law and how as a society we cope with injustice. I want to leave with a different comment though, Kevin, if I might move it, and that's to say that we're in a very unusual point where we have zero net migration from Mexico for 2 years. But you listen to the political rhetoric, it will not change in pitch because this is too politically powerful an issue. It has nothing to do with the facts. It has nothing to do with reality. It has nothing to do with human need. It's about votes, and political power sustains itself by creating a them that can be the straw man, the threat that gives this power to those who are withstanding the threat. So they have to create a threat to do it. And I think we are far from having found a solution by understanding law, as long as we have politicians who think they can get away with this by the silencing of people.
Do each of you want to make a final comment?
I'm voting for Bernie Sanders.
Running.
Brooklyn is a good man.
Yes, I just would make one comment that it touches on the deservingness and I don't know if people know that permanent legal residents can be deported as well. And about the veterans who have served this country who are being deported in the thousands, who are becoming homeless in Tijuana. And so this is, talking about deserving, these are people who, vets are so respected and with good reason. And yet, using this job of being, of having committed a crime, and the crime is that they became homeless at some point. And they were arrested and then placed in deportation procedures and deported. That's happening, but it's using this mechanism that we've been talking about, using the mechanism of moving people into these conditions of illegality that allow for even the most deserving people to be removed. So this is something that people need to be educated about. People need to have to have discussions and to really to share knowledge in the form of maybe short reports, not academic articles, that are going to be more educate people in the media, so that they also present a side of the news that is not so also charge against immigrants. So that's all.
So I want to thank you all again for being with us this evening, and I want to close with one last plug for the book. You can pre-order it outside. It'll be out in May, which is just a day away. And if you sign up here, you get a 20% discount and free shipping. So this is your opportunity for the best deal on offer this spring.
And our poor little children get to eat.
In the process
Think
of
of
the
the
book,
children.
go to Mira and to the
Oh, that's right. I
Yes,
forgot
the process of the book.
our children don't get to eat.
Children
Which I made the other person, I forgot.
But the march goes on. The struggle is supported by the
Yes,
proceeds
yes,
of the
yes,
book.